All right, let's talk about something that happens all the time in the corporate world, something that's actually kind of terrifying. We're going to look at how an organization's own reaction to a crisis can end up being way more destructive than the crisis itself. Let's dive in.
So let me ask you a question. Just think about it for a second. What could possibly be worse than, say, a massive oil spill, a citywide public health disaster, or a product recall that ends in real tragedy? What's worse than that?
The answer? The organization's own reaction. It's that institutional behavior that takes a really bad situation and just pours gasoline on the fire, turning it into an absolute reputation-shattering catastrophe. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack today.
So here's the game plan. We'll start with what's called the crisis multiplier. Then we'll get into three classic dysfunctional responses. You've got the ostrich effect, the wall of denial, and the good old blame game. And finally, we'll see how all of this leads to losing the one thing you can't get back: credibility. You see, here's the core idea. Certain reactions from an organization act like a multiplier for disaster. And we're not talking about honest mistakes here. We're talking about really toxic behaviors that just poison any chance of finding a real solution. If you don't spot them, and fast, they can leave a permanent scar on a company's reputation.
So, our first dysfunctional behavior is something people call the ostrich effect. Burying your head in the sand. It's probably the simplest and maybe the most common way to kickstart a total catastrophe. Just pretend the problem isn't there.
This is what happens when leadership just decides to stay the course, either because they're totally oblivious, or worse, they're just willfully blind to a huge threat that's growing right in front of them. They turn a blind eye, and then they act all shocked when the whole thing blows up in their face. And if you want a perfect tragic example of this, look no further than the Exxon Valdez oil spill. I mean, just look at this timeline. In those critical first hours and days, Exxon's response was just fatally slow. They downplayed how big the spill was, which created all this confusion and mistrust. By basically ignoring the reality of what was happening, they let the crisis spiral completely out of control.
And the consequences, they were just devastating. Exxon's reputation was absolutely shattered. The delayed cleanup caused immeasurable long-term harm to the Alaskan ecosystem. And of course, the legal and financial penalties were just massive. And all of that was magnified, not just by the spill itself, but by that initial failure to just face reality.
Okay, so ignoring a problem is bad. But let's look at a behavior that's a little more subtle, and honestly, often even more destructive. This is when you make the active, conscious decision to build a wall of denial. Now here's the key difference, and it's fascinating. Unlike just ignoring a problem, denial means you know something is wrong. But, out of arrogance or just fear of confrontation, leaders actively refuse to do anything about it. They build this wall of denial, and once it's up, it becomes almost impossible to climb down from. And there is no more sobering, tragic example of this than the Flint, Michigan water crisis. This case study really shows the profound human cost when officials choose denial over their duty. This timeline just shows the awful escalation. I mean, as soon as the water source was switched, residents started reporting serious problems. But instead of listening, what did officials do? They repeatedly and publicly insisted the water was safe. They chose to deny the evidence right in front of them, and that denial turned a crisis into a public health catastrophe.
The consequences were, and still are, just heartbreaking. Residents, especially kids, were exposed to high levels of lead, which has caused long-term health issues. Public trust was completely destroyed. And the officials involved? They faced lawsuits and even criminal charges. This is the real-world cost of denial.
Okay, on to our third dysfunction. And this is one we've all seen before: the blame game. It's that instinct to admit, okay, yeah, there's a problem, but then immediately make it someone else's fault. Crisis managers actually have a name for this. They call it compartmentalizing.
So the thinking goes something like this. Yes, there's a problem, but it's not our problem, right? It's the supplier's fault, or it's the media's fault, or it belongs to a whole other department. The thing is, the outside world doesn't see your internal divisions. To them, your problem is your problem, period. This reaction always looks defensive, and it makes a unified, effective response pretty much impossible.
Oh man, a classic case study of this is the Ford and Firestone tire recall crisis back in the late 90s. Reports were coming out about these catastrophic tire failures on Ford Explorers, leading to rollovers, injuries, even deaths. And instead of a unified response, what we got was two corporate giants declaring war on each other.
And this slide just lays out the conflict perfectly. Ford pointed the finger at Firestone, blaming their tire design. Firestone pointed the finger right back, blaming Ford's vehicle specifications. And while these two giants were fighting this public war, people's lives were literally on the line.
The fallout was exactly what you'd expect. The public was confused and just lost trust in both of these iconic brands. All the finger-pointing delayed a real solution, all while the media scrutiny got more and more intense. In the end, both companies suffered enormous financial and reputational damage. By trying to push the problem away, they both ended up owning it anyway.
So after all that, what's the big takeaway? These three dysfunctions, ignoring, denying, and compartmentalizing, they all lead to the exact same disastrous outcome. They spring what we call the credibility trap.
So let's bring it all together real quick. We've seen the three deadly sins of crisis management: ignoring the problem, just hoping it'll magically vanish; denying it and actively fighting against reality; and compartmentalizing, just making it someone else's fault.
And this quote, man, it just absolutely nails the problem. Once an organization gets caught in a lie, it suddenly has a double burden. It still has to fix the original mess, but now it has to do it without its most crucial asset, credibility. And once that trust is gone, every single move you make is met with suspicion.
And that leaves us with one final, really crucial question. This isn't just about having a crisis plan. It's about building a culture of courage. So how do we create organizations that are brave enough to actually face the truth before a crisis becomes a catastrophe? That is the real challenge. Thanks for tuning in.